Hi, I'm David Wood.
And I am the Apostate Prophet.
We're about to reach 2 important milestones on our YouTube channels.
I will soon pass 200,000 subscribers.
And I'm about to have 100 million views.
We thought we should do something fun to celebrate.
And what could be more fun than having a debate?
But there is a problem. We can't debate an Islamic topic because everything David says about Islam is completely true.
And everything AP says about Islam is 100% accurate.
I guess great minds think alike.
I was just thinking the same thing.
But then we realized we do disagree on other issues.
I'm a former atheist, now a Christian.
I'm a former Muslim, now an atheist.
I think we're going to disagree on a lot.
Watch this. Hey David, what's the source of moral obligations and values?
God.
Wrong.
Care to debate that?
I would.
You know, we're both YouTubers. Maybe we should debate through a series of videos.
Perfect. Make a video stating your case, and I'll make a video stating mine. And then we will go back and forth until someone cries.
That'll have to be you, because I don't cry.
Yeah, when I'm finished with you, you will have to change your name to Atheist 17 Apologetics, or Act 17 Atheists.
When I'm finished with you, you're going to be the apostate from atheism.
Prepare to have your arguments refuted.
Prepare to thank God for introducing you to me.
Prepare to become the latest horseman of atheism.
Prepare to become the next Nabil Qureshi.
As for the rest of you, we're going to set a good example by getting along, even while criticizing each other's views.
So for all you Muslims who are rejoicing right now because you think we're going to start attacking each other and forget about your fake prophet,
don't be stupid. We will never stop bashing Muhammad. On the contrary, we will show to the world how a Christian and an atheist can have a debate while still wreaking havoc on your little prophet and his precious book.
So stay tuned for our epic debate.
And stay away from Islam.
Well, here we are, the debate so many of you have been waiting for. In one corner, we have our hero, a Christian former atheist, David Wood, aka the Dizzle, defender of the downtrodden, friend of the fatherless, enemy of oppressors. And in the other corner, we have our villain, an atheist former Muslim, Ridvan Aydemir, aka the Apostate Prophet, soon to be known as the apostate from atheism, and perhaps the next Nabil. I'd like to thank AP for agreeing to unite our platforms as we explore the connection between God and morality. But I should point out here at the beginning, the two great blunders AP has already made, one very common blunder and one very uncommon blunder. The common blunder can be seen around the world. It's a form of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. As millions of Muslims are abandoning Islam, many of them end up abandoning far more than Islam. Instead of simply rejecting Muhammad as a prophet and the Quran as the word of Allah, they decide to reject religion in general, the existence of God, and anything associated with a supernatural realm. The problem here, apart from being overly hasty and wrong, is that some beliefs that ex-Muslims want to keep actually depend on things that they're throwing out. Much of this debate will focus on one particular example. So that's the common blunder. The uncommon blunder is that AP has entered into a structured, careful, in-depth debate stretched out over several weeks. As a rule, if you want to go on thinking that our beliefs about morality can be rationally justified without God, you have to keep your thinking pretty superficial. You have to rely on rhetorical tricks and misrepresentations of your opponent's positions. You don't want to take the time to ponder the issues rigorously and meticulously. It seems then that AP's atheism was doomed to destruction the moment we agreed on a format. But don't take my word for this. Let's start the debate and see what happens. When we talk about morality, we're talking about things like moral obligation. Human beings have moral obligations to do certain things and not to do other things. Moral value, some things are intrinsically good. Moral responsibility, certain actions make us worthy of praise or blame. Moral improvement, people become better or worse, and so on. Here in my opening statement, I'm going to focus on moral obligation. Many of AP's criticisms of Muhammad have to do with Muhammad violating basic moral obligations and commanding or allowing his followers to violate basic moral obligations. But what are we doing when we say that someone who lived 14 centuries ago in a completely different part of the world should have followed certain moral rules that we somehow have access to? What sense does it make to impose moral obligations across space and time? It seems that moral obligations have some peculiar features. Let's consider 4 of these peculiar features. First, moral obligations are most naturally expressed and understood as authoritative commands. They're imperatives. Do this, don't do that. This raises an obvious question. Who's issuing these commands? The answer to that question is extremely important because if the commands don't come from someone or something with the proper authority over us, we have no obligation to obey them. Second, moral obligations are objective, meaning that we can be right or wrong about them. If an old man thinks that it's perfectly acceptable to have sex with a prepubescent 9-year-old girl, the fact that he thinks it's perfectly acceptable doesn't make it perfectly acceptable. He's simply wrong. The wrongness of the act is a moral fact, and as the saying goes, facts don't care about our feelings. Now, how can there be facts about morality that are independent of what we think or believe? Moral obligations aren't the sort of things we find out there in the world. We don't find them with a microscope or a telescope. They're in our minds, and yet somehow independent of our minds. So what's the basis of their objectivity and independence? Third, moral obligations are overriding, meaning that they trump other kinds of obligations. If the government makes a law ordering you to hand over Jews or Muslims so that they can be sent to concentration camps, your moral obligation not to treat your fellow human beings that way overrides your legal obligation to aid in their abuse or extermination. We have all sorts of obligations in our lives. Why would one particular kind of obligation, moral obligation, override all others? Fourth, moral obligations are universal. We apply them to everyone with a properly functioning mind. Commands like don't torture old ladies for fun apply to all sane human beings. If we hear that someone has been torturing old ladies for fun, we would condemn his behavior regardless of where he comes from, which religion he follows, or what his political views happen to be. Why are we convinced that the commands in our heads are somehow commands to all human beings? So, moral obligations have some interesting features, and a good theory of morality should clarify and explain why moral obligations have these interesting features. The problem for our atheist friends is that atheistic theories of morality don't clarify and explain why moral obligations have these features. Instead, atheistic theories of morality undermine our moral obligations and suggest that we're delusional about our moral obligations. That's why some of you atheists, as I was drawing attention to some very basic features of moral obligations, were thinking to yourselves, no, moral obligations aren't objective. No, they're not universal. Your metaphysics has mutilated your concept of moral obligation until someone does something to you, in which case you'll suddenly snap back to believing in objective, overriding, universal moral obligations. Fortunately, theistic theories of morality don't suggest that we're delusional about our moral obligations. Take what's called divine command theory. Divine command theory claims that our moral obligations are commands of God. Now, atheists tend to misunderstand this theory in 2 ways. One, they think that divine command theorists are asserting that you can only know what your moral obligations are if God gives you some special revelation like the Bible or the Quran. I've heard Muslim apologists make claims along these lines. It seems to be fairly common in Islam to think that apart from God telling you something through some special revelation, you just don't know what to do. But outside of Islam, I've never heard a divine command theorist say that we can only know what our moral obligations are through something like the Bible or the Quran. There can be specific commands given in Scripture, but as far as general moral obligations are concerned, all rational human beings have some kind of access to them. Divine command theory is a philosophical claim about what moral obligations really are, what their nature is, what their status is, not about how we become aware of them. As far as how we become aware of our moral obligations, God can communicate through special revelations such as the books of the Bible, but this wouldn't be the only way that we learn about our moral obligations. God creates us with a capacity for understanding moral truths, just as He creates us with a capacity for understanding mathematical and logical truths. God can communicate His commands through the human conscience. The Bible talks about Gentiles who haven't received any special revelation obeying God's commands by nature because God's commands have been written on their hearts. The main way we learn about our moral obligations is by being taught. Think about a parallel with something like mathematics. People had to figure out mathematical truths down through history, but once they figured out mathematical truths, these mathematical truths were then passed down through teaching, education. Your parents taught you numbers and basic operations. You learned more difficult concepts in school. Likewise, your parents taught you basic moral obligations. You learned more from society and so on. So, we arrive at our knowledge of moral obligations through a combination of factors. We have a capacity for learning moral truths. Most human beings have a conscience. Other people teach us our moral obligations, and we read about them in Scripture. The other common atheist misunderstanding here is thinking that divine command theorists are asserting that you can only be moral if you believe in God. Here again, that's not what divine command theory claims. Think about mathematics again. Here's a question. What is a number? You might think that it's just a concept in your head, but numbers seem to have some sort of reality apart from our use of them. The laws of nature have numerical constants in them. Numbers are everywhere in nature, whether we're aware of them or not. So what are they? Suppose, hypothetically, just as an illustration, that the true reality of numbers, their ultimate reality, is that they are eternal ideas in the mind of God. I'm not claiming that. Again, this is just to illustrate. Suppose that numbers are eternal ideas in the mind of God. We could call this divine number theory. When God creates the universe, He uses numbers, which is why numbers are everywhere. And God creates us in His image with a capacity for doing mathematics, which allows us to use mathematics and to discover the numbers in nature. Notice, if divine number theory were true, you could still use numbers, you could still do math, you could still uncover the laws of nature, even if you didn't know that numbers are actually eternal ideas in the mind of God. You could still do math even if you didn't believe in God, because you've been created with the ability to do math regardless of what you believe about God. Similarly, if divine command theory is correct, your moral obligations are, ultimately, commands of God. But you become aware of those obligations in a variety of ways, so you can honor your moral obligations even if you have absolutely no clue what their ultimate nature is, and even if you don't believe that they come from God. Now, if we can honor our moral obligations without knowing where they come from, why do we need something like divine command theory? Well, we seem to understand that it's important to know where our moral obligations come from. There's a reason there are so many theories of morality being discussed at the scholarly level and at the popular level. We want a theory that explains and justifies our beliefs about right and wrong. Divine command theory accomplishes this task quite well. Consider the 4 features of moral obligations we discussed earlier. Moral obligations are most naturally expressed and understood as authoritative commands. Do this, don't do that. Why are they most naturally expressed and understood as authoritative commands? Because they're authoritative commands. They're commands from God. Moral obligations are objective, meaning that we can be right or wrong about them. How can they be objective? Because God has issued certain commands. If you think you have a moral obligation and it actually comes from God, then you're right about your moral obligation. If you think you have a moral obligation and it doesn't actually come from God, you're wrong about your moral obligation. This is why we can look at people who have significantly different moral views and conclude that someone is wrong here. There are people who are very bad at math. There are people who are very bad at logic. And there are people who are very bad at morality. Moral obligations are overriding, meaning that they trump other kinds of obligations. Why are moral obligations overriding? Because a command from God, your creator and sustainer, takes precedence over other kinds of commands, such as commands from your government. Moral obligations are universal. We apply them to everyone with a properly functioning mind. Why are moral obligations universal? Because we're all created in the image of God, and our Creator has given all of us commands. So, divine command theory accounts for the main features of moral obligations quite easily. What about atheistic moral theories? Again, moral obligations are most naturally expressed and understood as authoritative commands. But where do these authoritative commands come from if they don't come from God? There aren't a lot of options for atheists. You could be hardwired to act in certain ways, in which case your DNA is somehow issuing commands, but it's difficult to see how a mindless molecule could be a proper authority on issues of morality. You could simply decide for yourself what your moral obligations are, in which case you'd be issuing commands for yourself. But if you're the one imposing moral obligations on yourself, you can obviously release yourself from those moral obligations, so that isn't helpful. Society certainly commands us to behave in certain ways, but something can't be right or wrong simply because society says so, because societies are, very frequently, moral failures. Given atheistic moral theories, what we think of as moral obligations don't seem to come from anything remotely resembling a legitimate moral authority, which suggests that our moral obligations aren't obligations at all. Moral obligations are objective. But how can they be objective if there's no legitimate moral authority behind them? How can it be true that I have an objective moral obligation to do X if what I think of as my moral obligations are just inclinations provided by my DNA or personal choices or the latest views of my ever-changing culture? Moral obligations are overriding. But why would an inclination provided by my DNA or a personal choice or some rule of society trump all of my other obligations? Moral obligations are universal. But if what I think of as my moral obligations come from my DNA or my personal choice or my society, why in the name of common sense would I think that a different person with different DNA in a different society has any of the same moral obligations I have? The peculiar features of moral obligations make no sense in an atheistic world. Instead of explaining why moral obligations are expressed as authoritative commands, why they're objective, why they're overriding, and why they're universal, atheistic theories suggest that our ordinary moral thinking is delusional. AP is welcome to prove me wrong here, but good luck with that. I was plumbing the depths of morality and immorality long before the Apostate Prophet figured out how to put on his lederhosen in Deutschland. When I say that moral obligations just don't make sense in an atheistic world, this isn't David Wood, the Christian, insulting an opposing position. It's how I ended up viewing morality when I was an atheist. Let me describe my thinking back then, and AP and the rest of you can tell me where I went wrong. Here was the worldview of David the atheist. We've got this massive universe, and over here, there's this little blob we call the Milky Way. Out on one of the spiral arms of the Milky Way is a ball of hot gas we call the sun. Circling that ball of hot gas is a speck of dust we call Earth. And on the surface of this speck of dust are these little lumps of cells called humans, who are only there because their ancestors managed to pass on genetic material better than other lumps of cells. And these human lumps of cells are now convinced that they have incredible significance and dignity, that what they do really matters, and that their deepest values, so precious to them, are something more than mutant traits that helped their ancestors transmit DNA or the product of cultural indoctrination. They think that they have objective moral obligations, but objective moral obligations make no sense whatsoever in this world. Everything we do is the result of signals and chemical reactions in our brains. But our brains are physical. They're made of particles, and particles are governed by laws of nature, which means that all of our decisions and actions were determined long before we were born. How can we possibly think of ourselves as morally responsible for anything we do? Notice, all I did there was apply the exact same reasoning to morality that I had already applied to religion. Earlier in life, I thought to myself, they tell me to believe in God. Some of them say that they can feel the presence of God. But I see absolutely no evidence for the existence of God, so I'm not going to live my life as if there's a God, no matter how much they don't like my skepticism. Then eventually I thought to myself, they tell me to believe in their moral values. Some of them say that they feel this or that is right or wrong, but I see absolutely no evidence for their moral values. So I'm not going to live my life as if their moral values are valid, no matter how much they don't like my moral skepticism. Some atheists are similarly consistent. They apply the same skepticism to moral claims that they apply to religious claims. You can read some Nietzsche or some J.L. Mackie for examples. Far more atheists, however, are extremely inconsistent here. They apply one level of skepticism to belief in God, and they reject the existence of God. But they don't want to reject belief in objective moral values, so they radically lower their level of skepticism so that they can go on believing in their moral claims. Inconsistency at its finest. God and objective moral obligations stand together or fall together. Nietzsche realized that. He tried to live consistently by rejecting both God and moral obligation. Then he went insane, although syphilis may have had something to do with that. I tried to live consistently by rejecting both God and moral obligation. I also started going insane. But a little before I was carted off to my third mental hospital, I re-examined the evidence, and I chose the other consistent path, God and moral obligation. And the world suddenly made sense. Now, before you atheists misunderstand me here, I'm not saying that you're going to go insane. That's reserved for a particular kind of people with a maniacal obsession for going wherever their positions lead them. I'm saying that in order to avoid believing in God and to avoid going insane, you're going to be inconsistent. And inconsistency is not going to win this debate. Prove me wrong, AP, if you're able.
Hi everyone and welcome, this is the Apostate Prophet. Today is a fantastic day because today we are witnessing a debate come true that the entire world has been waiting for. A debate that will change humanity forever. Yeah, so I'm Ridvan Aydemir, aka the Apostate Prophet, a non-religious, free-thinking, simple guy, and my opponent is David Wood, aka the Dizzle, aka stealing is wrong because of God, therefore God. I'm really happy that David Wood has agreed to have this debate. This exchange will be a good example of exchanging very difficult ideas when we have opposing worldviews, completely different worldviews and beliefs. And it will be a great opportunity to learn more about each other. Today, I will mostly be presenting my arguments independently and arguing that morals are entirely man-made and that they have nothing to do with God. But I will also respond to and directly reference certain things that David Wood has brought up in his opening statement. So if you have not seen that, make sure to go and watch that before this or afterward. In his opening statement, David Wood makes several assertions and assumptions to make his point. He argues that humans have a sense of moral obligations and that these moral obligations are objective and universal. He claims that humans recognize and agree upon moral values because they are facts which exist independent from our minds, and that we merely find and name them. He argues that humans universally feel the responsibility, the obligation to abide by these morals, and that we most naturally perceive morals as authoritative commands. The reason for that, he claims, is that these moral commands come from God, which is why we perceive them and why we find them. His position is that God gives us authoritative commands, which we can find through religions, but we can also find those commands if we do not follow religions, because God gave us these commands, communicates through our conscience, and creates us in such a way that we are capable of finding these commands. As nice as it sounds, I want to go ahead and respectfully mark almost all of that down as completely wrong, and as David already predicted, delusional. Yeah, I'm sorry. One mistake that David makes is that he assumes that I will or must argue for objective moral values or objective moral obligations. He presupposes that objective moral obligations are real and that I must somehow explain them, or I must explain why this is the case. In reality, morals are not universal, they are not objective. They are not mind-independent facts which we somehow have to find. Morals are not perfect and can't be perfect, and they don't come from some mysterious source that we can only explain with God. Morality is made by humans. It's purely functional. I usually consider myself a good person, but I only do that within the traditional social context in which we define good and bad. I am compassionate, considerate, empathetic, because that's what I was taught, by people who were taught the same by others, because they consider these qualities good or virtuous. I adopted these values, I lived with them, and I see that it makes sense to consider them good. I could choose not to be loyal to these qualities. Many people often choose not to. I do have a temper, on the other hand. I can be cynical, stubborn. I can lash out and hurt people's feelings. I can be very disagreeable. These things are generally considered bad, but only because we find them bad. Because that's what we were taught by others who were taught the same over generations. And why have humans learned that over generations? Not because there is some objective morality which we magically find, which comes from an inexplicable source. No, it is purely functional. Being considerate is considered good because others like it when we are considerate toward them, because it benefits or pleasures them. It makes for good interactions. And we like it when others are considerate of our feelings and our rights and our desires and goals. Hurting feelings is bad because people feel hurt, as the name says. We feel hurt, disappointed, upset, angry, resentful. For example, if I'm traveling by car and my car breaks down, I'm in the middle of nowhere, and I don't have phone coverage to call for help, and I also can't seem to fix my car, then I will immediately start looking for help, because my best bet is that somebody can come and help me fix my car, or at least help me call help. If we now see a stranger and we ask that stranger for help, then we will have different emotional reactions depending on how that stranger responds to us. If that stranger decides to heed our call and help us, then we will be happy because someone else gave us hope for a possibility to get out of our desperate situation. We will therefore be grateful and thank that person and consider that a good act, one which makes us happy, one which we learn to copy and to reciprocate. If that stranger refuses to help us, then we will be upset by the rejection and lose a little bit of hope, which we will naturally not appreciate. If that stranger not only refuses to help us and even takes advantage of us and takes our belongings, then we will get angry because we will lose something and be harmed by this stranger. He will push us even further into our despair and violate our goals and our desires. It doesn't even need to be further described. The stranger will have literally harmed us. And for that we will dislike the stranger and interpret his actions as inconsiderate, rude, wrong, or even evil. In this example, we see one thing, that our moral values and our interpretations of those moral values don't come from the sky, but rather directly from our own social interactions and communications. From how the stranger responds to us in our desperate situation, we take that it is good to help. We like the help that we receive, and we thank that stranger. And maybe we even develop a good relationship with this stranger. And the next time that we see a person in despair, and we see that a person needs help, we will be much more likely to remember our own desperate situation and the help we received, and we will want to help that person in despair. We don't need to be given a mysterious divine command in order to be afraid when we are lost, or angry when we are harmed, and happy when we find our way out, and pleased when somebody helps us. If the earlier example did not take place between two strangers, but rather between two neighbors, then our actions and our responses would be even more impactful. If our neighbor desperately needs our help and we go to their house and beat them up and take their food instead, then how can we expect to live in that place in the future? How do we think our life will be in such a neighborhood over time? Most healthy humans want to live their life in a happy, thriving way. Aristotle pointed out over 2,300 years ago that well-being or flourishing, in Greek eudaimonia, is the highest good which humans ultimately want to achieve. His explanation was that every motive that we have, like wealth, possessions, status, or attractiveness, is only a means to achieve something else, whereas eudaimonia, flourishing, well-being, is the only human good which we desire for its own sake, because we ultimately want to flourish and be well. We don't desire it for something else. And in the end, it is much better to help each other and to make life easier for each other than it is to hurt each other and to give each other more suffering and grief, which makes life harder for all of us. We would all rather sleep without worry, knowing that we are in a safe place, than be on edge and fear all the time that our neighbors might break in while we are sleeping and take our belongings or even kill us because we can't trust each other. This is not a certain knowledge which we have acquired, which needs to be commanded by a higher being. It is entirely logical. It is a natural part of the beings that we are, who can think, who can reason, who are intelligent, and who are social for their own sake. Think about it. A group of 3 people who become friends because they have things in common. They will expect each other's sympathy, friendship, each other's help and trust. If now one of these 3 people was an incredibly deceptive individual who goes and stabs his friends, then these other 2 wouldn't simply tolerate this because they feel direct harm. They would naturally despise that and condemn this person and reject them as a friend, or maybe even take more drastic measures. This is quite normal, natural, functional. David gave the example of torturing an old lady for fun and said that we would naturally condemn that or universally condemn that. First off, most of us would most likely condemn that, because most of us know old ladies or become old ladies. We know old ladies. We have old ladies that are close to us. They are part of our society, our families. Their company makes us happy. We relate to them. We feel empathy. We are communities with agreements, with obligations. If I did consider it fun, for example, to simply go and torture my grandmother, then she would feel hurt. The result would make her hate me. My action would have immediately destructive, dysfunctional, distressing impacts on our relationship and on everybody around us. Not to mention, we don't want senseless torture to happen to us. Why would we do it to somebody else? This is not a command that we need to receive. It is quite logical. And since we are all humans universally, and we have similar human experiences, it is then quite normal that we find it detestable, wrong, absurd to torture an old lady for fun, which is why we will condemn this and reject this and judge it wherever we are. And we would never normalize that. Since we are societies and we keep these morals, which we then give to each other as rules, as authoritative commands, it is quite normal that certain morals like these are universal. In all of this, where is God? If our despair, the help that we ask for, the good or bad response we get from a stranger, our reaction to their response, and what we learn from this is purely functional and logical, natural, existential, then where is God in this? God is not in the value of help and harm, nor in the obligation or responsibility to help and not to hurt each other. God is nowhere in this. I want to address one thing here, which I know David will bring up. When we point out that humans make their own morals and that they... When we point out that humans make their own morals and that they make these morals for functional reasons, many people then draw the false conclusion that we do accept or must accept the bad morals which certain societies establish, or which majorities establish, such as the Nazis and the Holocaust. But that is a wrong thought. It completely misses the point. When I am arguing that humans make their own morals for functional, useful, utilitarian reasons, I am merely observing and explaining that this is what people do. I'm not saying that people are always amazing and always right, and that they come up with the best rules. On the contrary, it is entirely possible that humans also have wrong ideas, that they delude themselves, and that they come up with very bad ideas, which eventually harm themselves, harm others, or harm their environments. Just because humans are intelligent enough to establish their own morals for their own sake, that does not mean that humans are not stupid enough sometimes to create very bad morals. How moral values and obligations come into existence is one question. How we judge them as right or wrong is a different question. Unfortunately, David also seems to assume that it would normally, without God, not be possible for me to judge the actions of Muhammad, for example, as right or wrong. And that I am able to judge Muhammad's actions as right or wrong because I am, without acknowledging it, appealing to a certain objective morality which all humans, regardless of time and space, have to abide by. That is wrong. Personally, I don't judge 7th century Arabia Muhammad for the child marriage or the slavery. Similarly, I don't judge Napoleon or Genghis Khan or Charlemagne or Alexander the Great. These are people of their own times. I wouldn't even talk about Muhammad if he was not the main figure of Islam imposed on us in our time. When I judge Muhammad, I am judging him as the presented perfect example for all humankind, because that's what Islam implies. That it brings the perfect morals for all humankind, for all times, and that these perfect morals are found in Muhammad's behavior. Yet in our time, slavery and child marriage are unacceptable. The real question would then be, why do I judge slavery and child marriage as wrong? Is it because of some divine command which we find in nature? It's not. Child marriage was quite normal in the royal courts of Europe and Asia over the last 2000 years. Slavery was considered normal in Muslim and Christian societies, and it wasn't Christianity or Islam that got rid of slavery. Take child marriage. Through our advanced understanding of anthropology, medicine, and modern psychology, we learn that child marriage is incredibly harmful to a child. It damages a child psychologically, physically. It restricts the ultimate happiness, the ultimate well-being of a child. And children are us. We were children. They are our children. We love them and we take care of them. They give us hope. They make us happy. They depend on us, and these children become adults like you and me. It is then normal that if we find out that something is incredibly harmful to children, that we take certain measures in order to outlaw and reject these harmful things. It is very clear, morals are man-made. We make them for a reason. Morals are not facts independent from the human mind, as David Wood claims. Not even like numbers. You might want to argue that murder is wrong and that this is a fact, but it is not really a fact in the truest sense. It is only a fact because you want it to be a fact, because humans almost universally find it wrong. Not because wrong is a quality of murder in and of itself. It is because we don't like murder and its consequences. If we say the earth exists, that is a fact. This is a mountain is a fact. We see the mountain, we give it a name, we point at it. The dog has legs is a fact. We see the legs, and we call them legs. The dog has 4 legs is a fact. We make up numbers to describe the fact that the dog has so many legs. Or so many, depending on where you are in the world. Water is wet is a fact. We observe what happens when water touches a surface, and we call that wet. Killing ends a life is a fact. The act of killing results in the death of somebody. Killing is wrong is not a fact. The wrongness of killing is not something that naturally exists independent from our mind, which we then merely need to learn and point at. The wrongness of killing is something that we, humans, decide and agree upon. It depends on us. If nobody judged killing as wrong, then killing would be nothing else but simply the ending of a life. We evaluate it and judge it as wrong due to its undesirable consequences. Consequences that we find undesirable because they threaten us. They prevent our peace. They increase our suffering. They make our societies unlivable. I mean, mostly we don't even say killing is wrong. We say murder is wrong. Because we decide what kind of killing is justified and what kind of killing is wrong. What we call wrong here is merely an expression of our attitude, of our feelings about murder, not something that is independent not a fact. If I asked David or the average religious person why murder is wrong, then they will either tell me that it is wrong because God says so, which would be a very absurd answer, or they will begin to explain to me why murder is wrong and why God forbids it, but their explanation to why murder is wrong will be completely about earthly things, about secular, societal, natural reasons, which make God completely obsolete. If murder is clearly wrong for logical, functional, natural reasons, then where exactly is God in this? If we find murder wrong because it is destructive, it harms our nature, us, and that we can find this by simple reasoning, then why would we argue that this is a command that comes from God? If murder is naturally wrong, which is why God forbids it, then does that mean that it is wrong independent from God, regardless of God? Which would mean that morals are independent from God, outside of God, or even that God adopts morals. It is all absurd. The only way out is very simple. Murder is considered wrong because it clashes with the human will to live. It eliminates mutual trust. It is dysfunctional and destructive to societies, which is why every society universally condemns it and bans it. It is purely functional. God is nowhere in this. There is so much more to say, such as, for example, the role that empathy and science play in morality, but I will leave that to the rebuttals. David's fault is that he assumes, as is so common, that I must account for some perfect morality, for independent, objective moral values and obligations that are out there, and that there must be something that we are accountable to, which is why we have moral obligations. This expectation clouds David's judgment. The idea that humans make their own reasons, that they don't have a supernatural force which they are responsible to, the idea that humans don't have a natural obligation to abide by certain moral commands, and that humans do come up with very bad ideas, with atrocities, with cruelties, is scary, even to David. It seems depressing and disturbing and looks like it must be wrong at first. But simply appealing to God when there is no reason to invoke God and placing God into that perceived gap will not solve the problem. It will only cover the problem up. I personally simply prefer to accept human nature as it is, to embrace our existence, to give up on fantasies and expectations of perfection, not to be scared of the fact that I can do whatever I want, and to recognize that I have enough good reasons to be good. That it's good to be what we call good, and that being bad is not a great idea and doesn't make for a good life. But that's just me. David will want to push me on that anyway. It'll be fun. Now it's time for David Wood to get back with his rebuttal. Not that there is much hope. Thanks everybody and see you soon. David, I will be waiting for your response. Hurry up.